The city was alive that night. Glittering lights stretched across the skyline, taxis and rideshares zigzagging through the wet asphalt after an unexpected evening rain. Among them was Raj Malhotra, a middle-aged immigrant cab driver who had come to America a decade earlier chasing what he once believed was the dream. But dreams, he had learned, didn't come easy for people like him, people whose accents gave them away, whose skin tone made strangers assume they didn't belong, whose quiet humility was often mistaken for weakness. Raj's cab was his world. The worn-out seats, the faint smell of cardamom from his coffee flask, the hanging Ganesh idol on his dashboard. Small pieces of home in a place that rarely felt like home. Each night, he drove through the city streets, ferrying people who rarely saw him as a person, just a driver with a thick accent. He endured insults with silence, smiled through slurs, and told himself it was just another shift, just another fare. That night, he picked up a passenger from a luxury hotel downtown. The man, Ethan Shaw, a rising corporate executive in his early 30s, stepped into the cab with the entitled confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He wore an expensive suit, carried himself like the city belonged to him, and as soon as he noticed Raj's accent, something in his expression changed, subtle but unmistakable. Throughout the ride, Ethan made comments, small jabs about Raj's pronunciation, exaggerated imitations of his accent, and patronizing remarks about immigrants taking easy jobs. To him, it was humor. To Raj, it was humiliation. Every word landed like a slap, but Raj kept his focus on the road. He had been through worse. He knew reacting would only make things uglier. As they drove past the river, the rain picked up again. Traffic slowed and neon reflections rippled across the windshield. Ethan, impatient and dismissive, kept complaining about how slow Raj was driving, accusing him of not knowing the city properly. A common accusation, as if an accent meant ignorance. When they finally reached Ethan's destination, a glittering high-rise apartment complex, he threw a few crumpled bills at Raj without even looking at him. No tip, no acknowledgement, just a cold, arrogant wave of dismissal. Raj sat there for a few seconds, staring at the rain sliding down his windshield, feeling the weight of years pressing on him. For him, it wasn't just one rude passenger. It was a reflection of everything he had endured since he arrived, every job application rejected, every sneer. Every time someone had looked past him as though he were invisible. He turned off the meter and exhaled slowly, whispering to himself that someday things would change. Little did he know, karma had already started turning its wheel. The next day, Ethan's life began to show small cracks. His company, a powerful tech firm known for its ruthless efficiency, was about to undergo a merger. Ethan, who had spent years climbing the ladder, was confident he'd finally get the promotion he'd been promised. But as fate would have it, new leadership was coming in, and Ethan's arrogance would soon meet a force he couldn't manipulate. That morning, Raj woke early as usual. His daughter, Anaya, was leaving for college soon. The first in their family to attend a university in the U.S. Raj had saved every extra dollar for her education, often working double shifts to make it happen. His back ached from long hours of sitting, and his hands were rough from gripping the steering wheel, but the thought of his daughter's future kept him going. Later that day, while driving through downtown, Raj noticed a familiar face on a large billboard. Ethan Shaw. The ad was for a corporate campaign about diversity and innovation, with Ethan smiling beside models of different ethnicities. Raj stared for a long time, bitter amusement tugging at his lips. The man who had mocked his accent was now posing as a symbol of inclusivity. The hypocrisy stung, but Raj simply shook his head and drove on. Life, he believed, had a way of balancing itself out, even if it took time. That evening, while he waited at the airport's taxi stand, he overheard two passengers talking about the merger at Ethan's company. They mentioned that the new CEO coming in was foreign-born, someone from India with an impressive reputation for turning companies around. Raj's ears perked up. A faint smile crossed his face as he thought about what poetic justice might look like. Still, he didn't dwell on it. His world was small, confined to the hum of his cab and the ticking of the meter. He didn't know that his path and Ethan's were about to cross again, under circumstances that neither of them could have predicted. 2 weeks later, Raj's car broke down on a rainy night near the downtown office district. His phone battery was dead, his shift was almost over, and the street was deserted. He decided to take shelter at a nearby parking structure until the rain eased. That's when he saw it. a sleek black car skidding uncontrollably on the wet road. Crashing into a street light with a deafening thud, Raj rushed toward the wreck, his instincts taking over. Inside the car was a familiar face, bloodied, dazed, and terrified. It was Ethan Shaw. The man who had mocked him, who had humiliated him that night in his cab, was now trapped behind a crumpled steering wheel, his life hanging in the balance. For a split second, Raj froze. The memories of that night flooded back. The insults, the humiliation, the way Ethan had treated him like less than human. But then he remembered something deeper. The values his parents had instilled in him, the belief that compassion should never depend on someone's worthiness. Without hesitation, he broke the window, unlocked the door, and pulled Ethan to safety just before the car caught fire. Rain poured down as sirens echoed in the distance. Raj stood there, drenched, catching his breath, watching the man who had once sneered at him now lying helplessly on the pavement. When the paramedics arrived, Raj quietly disappeared into the night, not waiting for thanks or recognition. He went home, exhausted but strangely at peace. He didn't tell anyone what had happened, not even his daughter. But the story didn't end there. Ethan would wake in the hospital the next morning, haunted by the memory of the man who had saved him, a man he had once mocked and dismissed. He didn't yet know who his rescuer was, but he would soon find out, and when he did, his world would turn upside down. The sterile glow of the hospital lights pressed against Ethan Shaw's eyelids as he stirred awake, his body aching from the wreck. For a moment everything was a blur, the faint beeping of machines, the sharp smell of antiseptic, and the heavy weight of confusion clouding his thoughts. Then, slowly, fragments of the night returned: the rain, the swerve, the crash, and a face. A brown-skinned man, soaked to the bone, pulling him out of the wreckage just before the flames swallowed his car. He couldn't remember the details, only the intensity in the man's eyes, the steadiness of his hands, and the faint glint of something metallic on the dashboard of his cab, a small idol of a Hindu god. Ethan had seen it before, but where? The memory was buried beneath layers of arrogance and carelessness. For the next few days, Ethan remained in recovery, surrounded by cards from colleagues and messages from his assistant reminding him of meetings he couldn't attend. But something had changed. He couldn't shake the image of his rescuer, the stranger who had risked his life to save him. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became he'd seen that face before. Then it hit him. The cab ride, the night he had mocked an Indian driver for his accent, dismissed him without a tip, and left him humiliated in the rain. The realization hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. Shame washed over him, thick, suffocating, undeniable. He had treated that man with cruelty, and that same man had saved his life. Meanwhile, across the city, Raj was back on the road. His car had been repaired thanks to a small loan from a friend, and his routine had resumed as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He hadn't expected gratitude, nor did he seek recognition. Saving Ethan was something he had done out of instinct, not for forgiveness, not for approval, but because it was right. Yet deep down, a part of him couldn't help but wonder if the man he'd saved even remembered him. That week, a ripple of change moved through Ethan's corporate world. The merger that had been brewing for months was finally official. The company had a new CEO, Dr. Arjun Mahatra, a brilliant, self-made businessman from India known for transforming struggling companies into global powerhouses. Ethan, confident in his reputation, believed he would easily impress the new leadership. He'd spent years mastering the art of charm and manipulation, two skills that had served him well in boardrooms. The morning of the CEO's introduction arrived. The entire staff gathered in the sleek conference hall, whispering with curiosity about their new boss. The double doors opened and Arjun Malhotra entered, tall, confident, and composed. His presence commanded respect without demanding it. As the presentation began, Ethan listened with mild disinterest, still distracted by thoughts of the man who had saved him. Then, during a slide introducing the CEO's personal background, a photo flashed on the screen. A family picture of Arjun standing beside his younger brother, his wife, and an older man. The older man was wearing a driver's uniform. Ethan froze. He blinked, leaned forward, and stared in disbelief. The older man in the photo, it was Raj. For a moment, everything around him seemed to disappear. The applause, the polite laughter, the corporate buzz. His heart raced. The man he had insulted, the man he had treated like dirt, was not only his savior but the brother of his new boss, the very man who now held his future in his hands. Panic set in. Ethan's mind spiraled with fear. If Arjun knew about what had happened, his career could be over. His reputation, his status, his carefully crafted image, all could crumble in an instant. But there was something deeper than fear stirring in him: guilt. A heavy, festering guilt that no corporate success could silence. He had spent years looking down on people like Raj, equating worth with wealth, and now fate had flipped the mirror on him. Over the next few days, Ethan's anxiety grew unbearable. He found excuses to avoid meetings, his confidence faltered, and even his colleagues noticed the change. He began researching Dr. Malhotra, learning about his journey, from growing up in India, to building his empire abroad, to sponsoring education programs for immigrant families in America. Raj's name appeared briefly in an old article, a mention of a proud older brother who had sacrificed everything to help fund Arjun's education. The realization shattered Ethan's remaining pride. He wasn't just dealing with a random cab driver. Raj Malhotra was a man of quiet strength, someone who had endured hardship with dignity and turned his struggles into someone else's success story. Meanwhile, Raj remained unaware of the tangled web his simple act of compassion had created. His focus was on his daughter Anaya, who had just received news that she'd been selected for a prestigious scholarship. It was the proudest moment of his life. Every sacrifice, every long shift, every insult he'd endured suddenly felt worth it. Yet destiny wasn't done intertwining their lives. A week later, Raj received a letter in the mail, a formal invitation to a company gala hosted by Malhotra Global Industries. The letter came from Arjun himself, thanking Raj for everything he had done for their family and inviting him as an honored guest. Raj was hesitant. He wasn't used to luxury events. He was a simple man who felt more at home behind the wheel than in a ballroom. But at Arjun's insistence, he decided to go. He didn't know who else would be there, or how dramatically that night would change everything. The evening of the gala was a spectacle. Chandeliers glittered, music echoed, and the city's elite mingled over champagne. Raj arrived in his best suit, modest but neatly pressed. He felt out of place but carried himself with quiet dignity. Arjun greeted him warmly, embracing him in front of everyone, introducing him proudly as the man who made everything possible. Ethan, standing across the room, nearly dropped his drink. Seeing Raj there, not as a cab driver, but as the CEO's brother and honored guest, made his stomach twist. Shame and fear mingled inside him. He tried to avoid eye contact, but Arjun noticed him and, with a knowing smile, called him over. As Ethan approached, the air seemed to grow heavier. The man he had mocked was standing before him, calm, composed, and gracious, while he struggled to breathe through the guilt choking him. Before Ethan could speak, Arjun began addressing the crowd, sharing a story about sacrifice, kindness, and the unseen struggles of people who quietly shape others' destinies. As he spoke, he turned to Raj with tears in his eyes. Ethan's heart pounded. He knew this wasn't just a speech. This was karma setting the stage. The murmurs in the grand ballroom faded as Dr. Arjun Malhotra stood before the crowd, his voice calm yet commanding. His words carried an emotional weight that silenced even the most distracted guests. He spoke about integrity, humility, and the unseen sacrifices that often go unnoticed in the glittering world of success. His eyes, filled with pride, shifted toward his brother, Raj, standing humbly at the edge of the stage. The lights shimmered softly on Raj's face, revealing a lifetime of quiet endurance. The deep lines of struggle, the faint scars of exhaustion, and the gentle resilience of a man who had spent his life in service, not for wealth, but for purpose. The audience listened intently as Arjun told the story of their childhood in India. The years of hardship, the poverty that almost crushed their dreams, and the older brother who worked day and night so that the younger one could study. Raj had driven a rickshaw back then, and later, when they immigrated, he drove taxis, through storms, long nights, and dangerous streets, so that Arjun could complete his education. His sacrifices had funded every opportunity that eventually built the Malhotra empire. Ethan stood in the crowd, frozen, the guilt in his chest deepening with every word. The man he had mocked for being a mere cab driver had been the very foundation of one of the most powerful corporate leaders in the country. Every cruel word, every sneer, every ounce of prejudice he had shown that night now echoed in his mind like a confession he could never take back. Arjun continued, his tone warm but firm. He spoke about how people often judge others based on appearance, accent, or occupation, forgetting that dignity has nothing to do with status. The audience nodded, visibly moved. Cameras flashed, capturing the emotional moment between the two brothers. Arjun called Raj to the stage, placing a hand on his shoulder as applause filled the hall. Raj, overwhelmed, tried to deflect the attention, but his brother's insistence was gentle yet unyielding. As he turned to face the crowd, Raj's eyes briefly locked with Ethan's. There was no anger there, no trace of vengeance, only quiet recognition. Ethan's heart sank further. The man had saved him once and now, unintentionally, was saving him again from his own arrogance. After the speeches, guests lined up to meet Raj, offering handshakes and praise. Ethan lingered near the back, torn between the urge to leave and the need to face what he'd done. He could no longer hide behind suits or titles. The weight of his hypocrisy was too heavy. Eventually, Arjun noticed him and called him forward. Ethan stepped into the light, every movement stiff with guilt. Arjun smiled, introducing him to Raj as one of our senior executives, sharp and ambitious. The words hit Ethan like a blade. He didn't deserve that praise. Raj extended his hand, his expression kind. Ethan hesitated, then accepted the gesture. In that simple moment, something shifted, not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. A silent understanding passed between them. The rest of the night blurred by, but Ethan couldn't escape the emotions clawing at him. As he drove home, his mind replayed everything, his prejudice, his mockery, and the sheer grace with which Raj had carried himself. The irony was cruelly poetic. The man he had deemed inferior had not only saved his life, but was also the brother of the person now controlling his career. Over the following weeks, the company's culture began to change. Arjun implemented programs focusing on diversity, empathy, and workplace fairness. He made it clear that the measure of a person's worth lay not in their background, but in their integrity and contribution. Ethan found himself struggling to adapt. His old habits of judging others, his ego-driven behavior, all felt hollow now. Every time he saw Raj's face in company newsletters or heard Arjun speak about him, the guilt resurfaced. But karma, as it often does, had more to say. One afternoon, Arjun announced a new initiative, a community partnership with immigrant-owned businesses. He wanted senior executives to volunteer their time mentoring small business owners, helping them navigate financial and legal systems. It was a noble effort, one Arjun believed would connect the company to its roots of compassion and service. When the volunteer list was released, Ethan's name was at the top, assigned to work directly with a small transportation startup led by none other than Raj Malhotra. The irony was undeniable. Fate had tied their paths together once again. Their first meeting was awkward. Ethan arrived early, nerves twisting his stomach. Raj greeted him warmly, as though their history didn't exist. His demeanor was calm and professional, his focus on the project, not the past. He spoke about his dream to create a service that supported immigrant drivers, providing fair pay and safer conditions. A mission born from years of experience behind the wheel. Ethan listened quietly, realizing how narrow his worldview had been. Raj wasn't just a cab driver. He was an innovator, a man driven by empathy and vision. The more they worked together, the more Ethan respected him. His humility, patience, and quiet wisdom were a stark contrast to Ethan's former arrogance. Days turned into weeks. The partnership thrived. Under Ethan's guidance, Raj's startup began to grow, gaining investors and recognition. Yet Ethan knew deep down that Raj was the one truly teaching. Not about business, but about humanity. And then, one morning, news broke that shook the company. An anonymous whistleblower had exposed internal misconduct, executives manipulating budgets, taking credit for others' work, and exploiting lower-level staff. Ethan's department was among those named. Though he hadn't been directly involved, his name surfaced due to his previous reputation for cutting corners. The board demanded an internal review. Arjun, deeply disappointed, called for full transparency. Ethan's career, already fragile, hung by a thread. The whispers began again. The same kind of judgment he had once inflicted on others now turning back on him. But this time, there was one person who didn't judge him, Raj. When asked about the investigation, Raj quietly told Arjun the truth that Ethan had changed, that he had been working hard to make things right. His words carried weight. Still, Ethan knew he had to face the consequences. He volunteered to cooperate fully with the investigation, ready to accept whatever came. He couldn't undo the past, but he could at least face it with honesty. And as he walked into the boardroom that day, he saw Raj sitting quietly in the back. Not as an enemy, not as a reminder of shame, but as a symbol of grace. The man he once mocked had become the embodiment of everything Ethan wished he could be. What happened in that room would decide not just Ethan's career, but his redemption. The boardroom was silent when Ethan entered. The hum of the city outside was faint, muted by the heavy tension that filled the air. The long glass table reflected the pale morning light, and every seat was occupied by stern faces, executives, auditors, and Arjun Mahatra himself. It wasn't just another meeting. This was Judgment Day. Ethan felt the weight of every decision he'd ever made pressing against his chest. The documents before the board detailed months of corporate malpractice, falsified reports, unethical shortcuts, and systemic discrimination. Ethan's name wasn't at the center of it all, but his previous arrogance had made him an easy target. Once, he'd been the kind of man who would pass blame, twist facts, and manipulate perception. But not anymore. He stood there, steady but remorseful, as the evidence was reviewed. Arjun's expression remained unreadable, professional, composed, yet visibly disappointed. Ethan knew that look. It wasn't anger. It was the quiet grief of a man who had believed in integrity above all else. When his turn came to speak, Ethan didn't defend himself. He didn't shift responsibility. He admitted his past faults. The shortcuts, the arrogance, the dismissive way he had treated people he thought were beneath him. He confessed that, though he hadn't been directly involved in the current scandal, he understood why his name had surfaced. He had created a legacy of mistrust, and now he was paying the price. The room remained still. Even the air seemed heavy with consequence. But then Raj Mahatra stood from the corner of the room. He wasn't there as an accuser, but as a witness. He spoke calmly, describing the man he had come to know over the past few months. Not the arrogant executive from that night in the cab, but a changed one. He talked about Ethan's commitment, his humility, and his genuine effort to help immigrant entrepreneurs. His words carried sincerity, not flattery. Raj's presence, his grace, his willingness to speak for someone who had wronged him. It was more powerful than any defense Ethan could have made for himself. The board listened closely. For a moment, the walls between class, race, and history seemed to blur. Raj's words reframed the narrative, not just of Ethan's mistakes but of human transformation. After the meeting ended, Arjun approached Ethan privately. He didn't offer praise or forgiveness, only a quiet truth. He told Ethan that redemption isn't earned in a single moment, but through 1,000 small acts of integrity. He advised him to take responsibility fully, even if it meant losing everything. That night, Ethan went home to an empty apartment. The skyline outside glowed faintly, indifferent to human pain. He sat in silence, reflecting on how far he had fallen, not just in career, but in character. He thought about Raj, about his calm dignity and quiet strength. The irony was almost cruel. The man he once saw as beneath him had become his greatest moral compass. Days turned into weeks. The investigation concluded. Ethan wasn't fired, but he was demoted, stripped of authority, reassigned to community development projects under direct supervision. To some, it was humiliation, but to him it felt like grace. It was a chance to rebuild, not as a corporate ladder climber, but as a man learning to do good for once in his life. His first assignment was small, managing a city outreach program designed to help marginalized drivers transition into sustainable businesses. When he arrived at the modest office building, he found Raj there again, volunteering as an advisor. Their eyes met, and this time there was no awkwardness, no residue of shame. Only quiet respect. They began working together daily. Raj taught him more about empathy and leadership than any textbook ever could. Ethan started to understand the power of listening, truly listening, to people whose stories had been overlooked. The more time he spent in those crowded rooms filled with struggling drivers, single parents, and first-generation immigrants, the more he saw the mirror of his own flawed humanity. Each day stripped away another layer of ego. And somewhere along the way, a shift occurred, not in his position, but in his purpose. He no longer wanted to climb back up the corporate ladder. He wanted to help build something real, something human. One afternoon, as they wrapped up a long day of mentoring, Raj mentioned expanding the startup into a social initiative, a driver-owned cooperative that would provide education, healthcare, and benefits to workers who had been exploited by ride-share corporations. It was ambitious, maybe even idealistic, but Ethan was moved by the vision. He offered to help, not for credit, not for redemption points, but because he believed in it. Together, they began drawing up plans, pitching ideas, and gathering small investors. The project grew faster than either of them expected. Within months, it gained attention from local media and social justice organizations. For the first time in years, Ethan felt genuine pride, the kind that came not from success but from service. But just as the future began to look bright, a familiar storm gathered on the horizon. An internal email leak from the corporate office surfaced online. Messages from years ago, written by Ethan himself during his arrogant phase. The words were cruel, dismissive, and racist in tone. Though old, they resurfaced like ghosts, threatening to destroy the fragile redemption he had built. Social media erupted. News outlets picked it up. The man once accused of discrimination was trending again, this time as a corporate hypocrite. Arjun's office demanded an explanation. The board called an emergency meeting. Investors pulled out of Raj's cooperative project, fearing association. Everything they had worked for hung by a thread. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the screen, heart pounding with dread. He had thought he'd left that version of himself behind. But the past, once written, doesn't vanish easily. And this time, it wasn't just his reputation at stake. It was Raj. He knew what he had to do, but doing it might cost him everything, including the fragile respect he'd finally earned. The internet can turn from silent to savage in seconds. Within a single night, Ethan's name was everywhere. Screens across the city lit up with headlines calling him the racist executive, the man who pretended to change, the hypocrite who hid behind charity. It didn't matter that those emails were from years ago, written by a version of himself he no longer recognized. To the world, that distinction didn't exist. The fallout was brutal. Protesters stood outside the company building. Old colleagues distanced themselves publicly, issuing statements condemning his past behavior. Sponsors withdrew funding from Raj's cooperative project, claiming reputational risk. Every bit of progress Ethan had made, every ounce of trust he had earned, seemed to crumble overnight. He spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, thinking about every cruel word he had once written in those emails. Careless jokes, demeaning remarks, words that had been easy to type in arrogance, but impossible to erase in shame. He remembered how it felt to mock others, to feel powerful in his ignorance, to hide behind his privilege. And now he was seeing the full price of that arrogance. Raj called him once during the chaos. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. The idea of hearing kindness or forgiveness in that man's voice would have been unbearable. He didn't deserve it. He didn't even deserve the project they had built together. The board held another emergency meeting. Arjun was silent for most of it, but his disappointment was clear. Though the company knew the emails were old, they couldn't ignore the media storm. A public apology wasn't enough. The only way to contain the damage was for Ethan to step down from his position entirely. Effective immediately. When the news broke, the backlash quieted just slightly, replaced by the noise of victory from those who wanted to see him fall. For many, his resignation was proof that justice had been served. But Ethan didn't feel justice. He felt hollow. In the days that followed, he avoided public spaces, ignored messages, and stayed away from everyone, including Raj. He no longer saw himself as a man deserving of redemption. His good work now looked like a fragile disguise, one that had shattered too easily under the weight of truth. Still, despite everything, Raj refused to abandon the cooperative. He continued working quietly, even as investors fled. When Ethan finally gathered the courage to check the project's website, he saw a post written by Raj. It didn't mention Ethan by name, but it said something that pierced him deeply. Change is never clean. It's built on broken things being rebuilt by honest hands. Those words stayed with Ethan for days. He realized that maybe his story wasn't about redemption others could see. Maybe it was about change that only he could commit to, even when the world refused to believe it. So he went back to work, not as a corporate leader, not as a public figure, but as a man with a purpose. He sold his expensive condo, donated most of his savings to the cooperative, and began volunteering in person at their training centers. He didn't make announcements. He didn't ask for recognition. He taught drivers how to file business licenses, helped them apply for grants, and cleaned the offices when everyone else went home. At first, people looked at him with suspicion. Some recognized him from the headlines. Some whispered behind his back. But over time, they saw something different. A man who showed up every day, who stayed late, who never complained. Raj eventually came to see him. They didn't talk about forgiveness. They didn't revisit the past. They simply got back to work. And for the first time in his life, Ethan didn't need words. The silence between them was enough. A quiet acknowledgement that redemption wasn't declared, it was lived. Months passed. The cooperative began to grow again, slowly but steadily. New donors appeared, inspired not by flashy media campaigns but by real results. Drivers who once struggled to survive were now small business owners. Families were thriving. Then, one afternoon, an unexpected call came. A news outlet wanted to do a feature on Raj's cooperative, on how a small grassroots effort had succeeded where major corporations had failed. Raj agreed, but he had one condition: Ethan had to be part of the interview. Ethan resisted at first. He didn't want to be seen again, didn't want to risk bringing bad attention to the project. But Raj was firm. He said the story wasn't about reputation anymore. It was about responsibility. When the camera crews arrived, Ethan stood in the background as Raj told the story. The challenges, the growth, the mission. And then, when asked about leadership, Raj pointed toward him. He didn't name him as the fallen executive or the man from the scandal. He simply said, "This is someone who taught me that change isn't what you say you'll do. It's what you choose to keep doing when no one believes in you anymore." The piece went viral, but this time the comments were different. There was anger, yes, there always would be. But there was also something else: curiosity, even respect. People saw that the story wasn't just about one man's failure, but about two men, one wronged, one redeemed, choosing to build something better together. The scandal faded, the cooperative thrived, and Ethan finally began to feel something he hadn't felt in years: peace. But life wasn't done teaching him lessons. A few weeks later, Raj fell ill. It started small: fatigue, a cough, nothing alarming. But within days, it worsened. Ethan took him to the hospital himself, staying by his side as doctors ran tests. The results came back grim. Raj had a heart condition that required immediate surgery. The cost was immense and the recovery uncertain. Ethan tried to pay for everything himself, but Raj refused. He didn't want charity. He wanted Ethan to promise that the cooperative would continue, no matter what happened to him. As Ethan sat in the sterile hospital room, watching his friend, the man who had saved his soul, fight for his life, he felt the familiar weight of fear return. He couldn't lose the one person who had believed in him when no one else did. When the doctor came in with the surgical plan, Ethan felt his knees go weak. The surgeon's name tag caught his eye, and in that single glance, everything froze. The doctor's name was Arjun Malhotra, Raj's son. The same man who had once been his boss, the one who had given him a second chance, was now the one standing over Raj's life, holding the power to save him. The hospital corridor felt endless, the fluorescent lights flickering like an old memory refusing to fade. Ethan stood frozen in place, staring at the name on the surgeon's badge. Dr. Arjun Malhotra. It was a name that carried the full weight of his past, of the choices that had shaped his rise and fall. Raj's monitor beeped steadily behind the glass wall, his fragile breathing a quiet reminder that life didn't wait for people to make peace with their mistakes. The world had come full circle, and now the man who once held Ethan's career in his hands was standing between him and the life of the only friend who had ever truly forgiven him. Arjun's expression when he recognized Ethan was unreadable. The years had carved deeper lines into his face, but his eyes were still sharp, the eyes of a man who saw truth before it was spoken. Ethan wanted to explain, to say that he wasn't the same arrogant man he once was, but words caught in his throat. All he could do was watch as Arjun read through Raj's medical chart, calm and professional, as though the history between them didn't exist. The next few hours were a blur of surgical preparation. Nurses moved briskly, papers were signed, and Ethan found himself sitting alone in the waiting area, hands trembling. Every second that passed felt like a quiet punishment, a test of whether he had truly changed or whether life would remind him that some debts can never be fully repaid. He thought about the night he had first met Raj. Just another cab ride to him then, just another person he thought he was better than. And yet, that moment had been the start of his unraveling and his rebirth. Raj had shown him humanity when he deserved none. He had given him grace when the world had given up on him. And now, as machines whirred in the distance, Ethan realized that everything, the shame, the downfall, the redemption, had led to this single, fragile moment. Hours passed before Arjun finally emerged from the operating room. His face was masked with exhaustion, his surgical gown splattered faintly with traces of the long battle inside. Ethan rose to his feet, afraid to speak, afraid of what the silence might mean. Arjun met his gaze and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Raj had survived the surgery. The relief that crashed over Ethan was overwhelming, like air rushing back into lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. For the first time in years, he felt tears he didn't try to hide. Arjun didn't linger. He handed over a report, his tone measured and coldly professional, but beneath it was something unspoken. Not forgiveness, but understanding. Maybe even respect. The kind that forms not from words, but from witnessing another person's quiet fight to change. Over the following weeks, Ethan rarely left Raj's side. He brought him meals, handled paperwork, made calls to the cooperative to assure everyone that Raj would recover. The community rallied around him. The very people Ethan had once looked down upon now treated him like one of their own. It was a quiet kind of justice, one that didn't need headlines or applause. When Raj finally regained enough strength to speak, his first concern wasn't his own health. It was the future of the cooperative. He wanted to expand, to open branches in nearby cities, to train more drivers who faced discrimination and exploitation. Ethan promised him it would happen, no matter what it took, and he meant it. Months later, the cooperative had grown beyond anything they had imagined. What began as a small effort between two unlikely friends had turned into a city-wide movement. Drivers of every background, Indian, Pakistani, African, Latino, white, worked side by side. The brand wasn't just about transport anymore, it was about dignity, opportunity, and change. Investors who had once abandoned them now came knocking again, but Ethan and Raj refused to let money control the mission. Every decision was made with purpose, every success shared equally. They even opened a scholarship program for young people who wanted to start their own businesses but lacked resources. A way to break the cycle Ethan had once benefited from and Raj had once suffered under. Their story began to spread again, but this time it wasn't twisted by scandal or shame. It was told as a tale of unlikely friendship, of two men from opposite sides of privilege who found common ground through hardship and forgiveness. Even Arjun attended one of their charity galas, quietly donating to the cause. When Ethan saw him across the room, they exchanged a nod, a silent acknowledgement that the past no longer ruled them. And yet, Ethan never forgot what it took to get there. He carried the scars of his past not as burdens, but as reminders. Every insult he had once spoken, every cruel laugh, every act of arrogance. They were the bricks of the man he had become. He had learned that karma wasn't about punishment, it was about education. Life had taught him through loss, through humiliation, through the mirror of his own actions. One evening, years after that fateful cab ride, Ethan sat beside Raj at the cooperative's newest office. It was late, and the city lights flickered outside the window like distant stars. Raj was older now, slower, but still full of life. The laughter of young drivers echoed down the hall. People who never knew the pain that had built the walls around them. Ethan looked at the framed newspaper article on the wall. The headline read, "Two men, one mission, changing the road ahead." Beneath it was a photo of the two of them shaking hands. Raj's smile was bright, Ethan's eyes steady. He remembered every moment that led there. The mockery, the arrest, the shame, the forgiveness. The full circle of karma. He finally understood that life doesn't erase mistakes. It redeems them through what you do afterward. When Raj passed away quietly a year later, Ethan didn't cry publicly. He didn't hold speeches or attend ceremonies. Instead, he drove one of the cooperative's cabs through the same streets where their story had begun. He stopped at the intersection where he had once mocked the man behind the wheel and whispered a silent thank you. Then he started the engine and drove on. The road stretched endlessly ahead, full of lights and motion, carrying him into the kind of peace that only comes when a man finally makes amends not just to others, but to himself. And somewhere in the hum of the tires and the whisper of the wind, it almost felt like Raj was there again. Because maybe, in a way, he always would be.